As Rebecca mentioned, I'm ecstatic to be here with you all today. My name is Tyler Thur, and I serve a variety of roles for Michigan State University's Office of K-12 Outreach, which is sort of our professional development arm of the College of Ed. Here, my boss, who is a multiple MSU grad as well, would want me to say the number one ranked College of Ed across the United States. So I'm happy to bring that here. And those two roles don't seem super connected, but I'm hoping to sort of bring them together in a way that can sort of help with the goals of this program through tonight's discussion. So, first and foremost, as Rebecca mentioned, I serve as our Associate Director of Data and Evaluation. So, serving as the professional development arm of the college, trying to facilitate action research, formative assessments, evaluations of our program offerings and of efforts that are in districts that we partner with, and technical support and capacity building in the districts that we are tied to. The other part of that is I serve as the co-coordinator of the Michigan Education Policy Leadership Program, formerly Michigan EPFP, and the Advanced Education Policy Leadership Program, which brings together mid-career education policy professionals to advance those skills of policy leadership and networking and hopefully effectuate some change. And that's where Rebecca and I first met. We feel like we were on planning calls with that, and we're synergized in thoughts and everything. And so I'm glad that experience was sort of able to spill over to that. Those things feel very different in the abstract. There's data and then there's policy. What professionally I aspire to, and where I'm hoping today's conversation can go, is to link education policy and data informed decision making in a way that gets the most out of both worlds. I'm not going to claim to be the foremost data scientist with education policy ever. There are people who can tell you way more about clustered standard errors and regression analyses and qualitative procedures and all that. And similarly, I wouldn't claim to be at the forefront of every education policy decision that's being made. But what I do really pride myself on, where I think our office serves a unique role and where I want to leave today's session, sort of hopefully empowering all of the attendees here today and then all the folks watching online at a later date, is to serve as that conduit of data and evaluation to inform policy based on what's occurring in the classroom and based on what's occurring in school. I'll say too, the program's put together an amazing set of speakers. I'm probably going to put a little bit more emphasis on our attendees. And I think some of that's based in my footing in education. I was a former, English instructional assistant. I'm a current debate coach in the high school level. My wife just started teaching third grade. She's made all the embarrassing TikToks of me setting up her classroom. And so I really believe in teacher leadership. And I want to sort of celebrate the expertise that exists here and celebrate sort of the capacity for change. So that is my long introduction of who I am and why I'm here today and kind of where we're going. What I want to do, and as much as I have that background in the K-12 educational space, I'm now, 8 years into MSU, and I feel like once you're in higher education, you're forced to create long titles with semicolons and thankfully no hyphens or parentheses or things like that. But really the goal of this discussion today is to think about what capacity do educators have to lead data analysis and evaluation to then inform education policy that impacts them, their students, and their peers. And so in doing that, I want to break this up into 3 chunks: the people behind that, which is sort of you all and the folks that will watch; the policy area. I'm a big case studies guy. I like some specifics. So we're going to talk a little bit about education funding and some recent research that our office has done, maybe raising some alarm bells and the need for some support from educators. And then the process, which is hopefully the takeaway from this workshop, this conversation, this seminar that I'm hoping to leave you all with. And in doing that, I want to leave you all motivated and inspired to dig into an issue of advocacy that's salient for you in your local context, to think about your power as policy entrepreneurs in the teacher leader space, to understand sort of the importance of this in the context of school funding. And then again, the sort of meat and potatoes of this presentation, which is to collect, analyze, and evaluate diverse data sources, emphasis on diverse data sources and some non-traditional approaches to data gathering that I want to flag, to sort of inform the evaluation of federal funding and state funding and local funding efforts and programs to inform advocacy in the local context. So to start, I want to start with the people. I am a people person. I believe tremendously in the power of educators to inform their context. And I think that, with challenges, and you see survey data on the softening of public support for the teacher profession, the softening of students' willingness to go in the teacher profession, I think some of it stems from a fear of educators being acted upon, as opposed to educators sort of having capacity to inform decisions and the policy context that's around them. So from the political science context, as Rebecca mentioned, I have a master's of public policy, which informed a lot of my undergraduate study. There's this really emancipatory consideration of policy entrepreneurs that I wanted to flag. And I kind of want to analogize that to where I see teachers having capacity to lead some of these efforts and inform the debates that are ongoing in a way that then sort of facilitates the rest of this conversation. So on the right, I have a host of figures. There's Greta Thunberg, who's led on climate change consideration, Elizabeth Warren, who's led with the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau and banking regulations. I have some great nerdy Netflix recommendations for associated documentaries at some point we can maybe discuss in Q&A, along with Dr. Mona Hanna, who has led a lot of efforts around the Flint water crisis. She sort of facilitated the citizen scientist effort to identify the water crisis in the first place, drive solutions, and raise sort of cultural awareness and political awareness of that issue. And then John Kingdon, who's not a policy entrepreneur in the top right, but is sort of the guy who created this concept and has led sort of the thinking around this. And collectively, they sort of inspire what I think educators can be, which is energetic actors collaboratively working inside and outside of government spaces to promote policy innovations. And we're going to look at that today in the context of school funding debates and how educators can use program evaluations and their classroom data to inform and advocate for the structuring and the context and the levels of school funding that they feel are most appropriate on the local, state, and federal levels. But truly, what all of those individuals demonstrate and what the policy entrepreneurship conceptualization sort of begins with is a belief and an understanding that this can exist on any policy issue and that folks should sort of identify what they are saliently passionate about and use their local expertise to inform some of these debates. Because while policymakers are experts in political science and constituent relations and all of that stuff, at least in the Michigan context, and I know it's perhaps even more true in Texas with a legislature that meets every other year, they have to cover a range of issues and cannot always develop expertise on all of them, whether it's agriculture or education or economics or whatever else. They're very skilled, very expert practitioners, but sometimes they need the support of policy entrepreneurs to do some of the things that Kingdon mentions, to frame problems and to raise awareness of what contemporary challenges practitioners are facing in their field, to build coalitions and advocacy networks, to share information from the local context with the state and with the federal government, to lead by example. And then when there are success stories, to sort of scale up those success stories and find ways to inform future debates. So I'm starting with the folks in the room, and I'd like to sort of position us as our Elizabeth Warrens, as our Gretas, as, whatever policy entrepreneurs that sort of speak to you, and think about, as we transition into the school funding debate, what local expertise folks already have and what expertise they can generate and what data they can generate to support specific funding initiatives based on their local context. The other political science piece that I'll flag is the policy cycle. And again, there's limited time. I'm only going to go for 45 minutes, even though I'm a talker, because I want to leave time for questions and discussion and consideration and maybe even playing with some of the tools that I'm going to offer. But I'll briefly say that there's this really helpful framework that Cobb and Elder put forth that sort of breaks up policy change into policy design, which stems from first identifying a problem, becoming aware of it, which is placing it on the systemic agenda, and then putting it in the policy context, which is putting it on the formal agenda, policy implementation, and then policy evaluation. And we're going to kind of focus in on that evaluation piece because it informs what policymakers do once actions have occurred. And it also can kind of drive this continuous improvement process that I teased in the preview that I think data is lacking for, but local educators can really, really support. So in thinking about the people, we're thinking about the educators in the room, their place as policy entrepreneurs, and how they fit into the policy cycle and drive it forward in the development of policy that hopefully serves students in Michigan, where I am, or Texas, or anywhere else in the United States through this context. Okay, the policy. We're going to look at school funding in part because our office just had an opportunity to do some research on federal funding in response to the COVID pandemic. And, what academic would I be if not one to take a shameless opportunity to plug the research that we've been able to do, but also because I think it is very practical and malleable at whatever context you are, whether you're interested in local funding, state funding, or federal funding. In short, I'm worried. I don't think I'm the only person here. But I think there are two unique challenges facing school funding, whether it's local funding from property taxes, state funding from sales taxes, or whatever structure exists in whatever local context folks are engaging with, or federal funding, which is a small portion of education funding, but a not insignificant one nonetheless. My first concern is the expiration of federal ESSER funds, or elementary and secondary school emergency relief funds. My second concern is a changing political consensus around how schools use education funding, and how the public and members of government are talking about schools' use of resources. So, challenge number one has a big, scary name that I cannot claim credit for naming, but I think is very salient. And it is fears of an ESSER fiscal cliff. An ESSER fiscal cliff. So as mentioned, there was this unprecedented federal infusion of pandemic-related relief funds between March 2020 and March 2021. This was a bipartisan effort. It started under the Trump administration. It continued under the Biden administration. It involved politicians on both sides of the aisle. And there was an injection of $190 billion into K-12 districts across the United States to respond to the effects of the pandemic, to reopen schools, to address learning loss, to provide PPE, to provide access to technology, the whole gamut. For a while, there was a lot of excitement about what this opportunity meant for administrators in cash-strapped districts to be able to positively support students in ways that they never have been able to before. The challenge pops up in September of last year, which is, about 12 months ago. And it's not something that's first noted then. You see news articles that mention it all the way back in 2023. And even at the onset of the pandemic, when folks were encouraging districts to spend ESSER funds on non-recurring expenses, there's a fear about what happens when federal funds dry up. So we've heard analogies of water through a fire hose. Districts get this huge cash influx, but with the caveat that they have to obligate those funds to be spent by the end of September 2024. And at that point, those funds are gone. And if they use those funds for recurring expenses, whether those were operating expenses, whether they were staff bonuses that are now expected, whether those are new teachers, new support staff, new security infrastructure, whatever, they're going to need to find ways to fill in that lost revenue. On top of that, and this is sort of where it goes from a normal expiration of federal funding, are two trends that folks have flagged, which is declining public school enrollment. Again, I have greater contextual knowledge in Michigan, but a brief look at Texas seems that is a challenge in terms of homeschooling, private schooling, or just, mobility of students with time. And then state revenue uncertainty. All of that came before a wave of economic uncertainty around April of this year, and ongoing state budget debates about what revenue would exist. So in the Michigan context, we have this thing called the Consensus Revenue Estimating Conference every January and every May. In January, it was like, picture is good, things will be solid. In May, there was a lot more uncertainty about what revenue would exist for schools. And it's led to some significant polarization. We have a statutory requirement for schools to get a budget from the Michigan legislature by July 1. We are 2 months past that and have, no reconciliation between the Senate version and the House version. And to be totally frank, no real plan. There was an article in Bridge this morning as I was getting ready for this about, even state workers haven't gotten layoff notices yet, like they have in previous iterations of school funding. And schools are already talking about how are they going to take on high interest loans or cut or dip into general fund reserves in order to bridge the gap. I know Texas has had a little bit more functionality in getting a budget done. I had read that for the first time in 6 years, Texas was able to pass a comprehensive school funding proposal with funding increases, which is awesome. But I also know that it's a little bit of a double-edged sword and that it comes with less flexibility to districts and some challenges that at least some districts and some administrators are sharing about how they're going to use funds. So all that's to say, policy entrepreneurs, these teachers, leaders that we sort of started with, are left with a unique challenge of declining federal support of schools, and that's not even mentioning impoundment of title dollars and ambiguity about a federal budget, declining public school enrollment, which matters on a per pupil basis for allocation of resources, and state-based challenges about what revenue will look like. We found evidence that folks were feeling that. So I linked to, and I'm happy to share out a Google Drive link that has some of these reports. I can work with Rebecca to share the PowerPoint and just click through the many footnoted things. We put forth a report that asked basically districts that represented 20% of all ESSER spending in Michigan how they were feeling. The first piece we asked them was, how financially stable did you feel before funds came, during the ESSER spending period, and then after the ESSER spending period? And folks sort of suggested what I would have anticipated, which is, before and after was about the same, but there was a huge shift during ESSER funds where districts felt more financially secure than they had at previous periods. So if you look at the two small figures at the end, districts reporting that they felt not financially stable or only somewhat financially stable, in the during ESSER spending period, only 10% of our sample was saying they were feeling not stable or only somewhat stable. That's compared to basically 30% who said the same before or after the pandemic. So we saw one real upside of federal investment in schools was a sense of financial security and a sense of added flexibility that allowed folks to make decisions that they felt benefited their students. Similarly, we asked folks, as a screener question, just what extent did ESSER spending have on your budget? And we saw 92.3% of districts that we talked to said it had at least a moderate or a substantial effect. That was borne out too when we asked folks to assess in terms of what they were doing for the 24-25 school year, so last school year, with the expiration of federal funds, and what they were anticipating they would do. We saw folks anticipating some cutbacks, some added austerity, and we'll talk a little bit about 24-25 versus 25-26, but there were some markers of that insecurity intensifying. So of the districts we talked to, and this included both districts that self-identified as being financially stable and districts that, felt at risk, they felt there was some peril, 76.8% of the districts that we spoke to in Michigan, mentioned that they had a plan to find ways to save money, whether it was 41.7% of districts eliminating positions, or 53.3% of districts not posting vacated positions after a teacher resigned or moved on from the district or retired or whatever else. And then again, as I sort of footnoted, we saw some increases in those trends over time. So in terms of reducing non-wage benefits, which was a creative way some of the districts we spoke to found ways to make up lost revenue from declining federal support, there was almost a 15%, a 16.7% increase in districts planning to reduce non-wage benefits, a 15.5% reported increase in districts eliminating positions, a 12.7% increase in districts just not posting vacated positions out of the hopes of trying to save some money. So all that's to say, we had sort of seen some evidence, and here are some qualitative quotes. I'm a big qualitative guy. I like to hear what people are saying, but folks from rural, suburban, and urban contexts flagging the ways that the loss of these federal funds would impact their ability to serve students. And again, this is at a time too where there's decreased supply of federal dollars and an increased demand on schools because of added needs, whether they're social, emotional, economic, nutritional, behavioral, whatever, to impact students. As much as I love our work, I did want to flag we were not alone. In September, McKinsey did a similar survey. You can see sort of districts reporting that as they move into the 25-26 school year, they expect fewer federal resources. They expect that foundations will not fill in the gap, probably made even more true by federal funding cuts and calls for foundations to step in for there, and concerns about being able to find other grants to fill in. And then in Michigan, we have a school business officials organization that did a similar survey this summer, which flagged, some similar trends. I think especially the one to note is 42% of districts cutting staff through attrition. So avoiding sort of the painful process of laying folks off, but leaving previously filled positions unmet. So that's concern number one, and that's my data to back it up. The other thing is a little softer, if I'm going to be honest. I don't know if this would pass the most rigorous dissertation defense of what is your evidence and what is your proof. But I'm observing, especially in online spaces, increased apprehension to provide schools added resources out of a fear of waste, inefficiency, and abuse of those funds. So right in preparing this presentation, I was scrolling Facebook, which one day I will give up and find something more productive and healthy to do, but not today. And it caught me that some of our peers at MSU, down the hall from the Office of K-12 Outreach, which is where I work at EPIC, who does just exceptional work on ed policy research, had just posted a study that, in short, says Michigan schools are underfunded. And again, I'm not trying to base my life by the social media comment sections, but it shocked me that the second most common reaction was like the laugh emoji, and the number one comment with a bunch of reactions was basically an indictment of school funding's ability to solve structural problems. There's tweets that say the same, that especially focus on urban districts I've seen, though some rural districts too, that get a lot of federal funding. Again, in terms of ESSER funds, urban districts got a high share of ESSER funds because funding was based on title formulas. So sort of districts with high levels of poverty and at-risk students got more money. And it led to folks saying, why do you still have such low shares of students who are proficient on the MSTEP, which is the Michigan state test, or whatever other state level assessment exists, or the NAEP on the national context? And, a lot of think pieces that push further into the classic does school funding matter debate that's existed since the 90s. So again, this is not like unprecedented, but what it is to say is there is evidence of schools receiving fewer funds, and that may be getting worse down the road. There's more ambiguity about what school funding will look like. And I think there is a weakened political interest in changing that. That's where I hope folks can sort of step in. My, again, untested hypothesis is that part of the reason for the loss of political support for school funding, or at least the spiked interest in critiquing the effectiveness of schools' use of their funding, is an inability or an unwillingness of schools and districts to champion what's going well and to take serious the need for evaluation, both formative and summative, to assess here are cases where we invested money in programs that worked, and here are cases where we invested money in programs that didn't work. And so from a practitioner-oriented perspective, I'm asking and I'm hoping that the people in the room and the people sort of engaging with this as policy entrepreneurs can address the problem area of lacking support for school funding, federal funding cuts, federal ambiguity about what the Department of Education will look like, state level ambiguity about what support will look like, and even local level challenges, whether it's school boards, constituents, taxpayers, administrators, about what programs are or are not working by driving policy analysis and program evaluation that generates data even if it's just classroom level data, and even if it's perhaps creatively sourced data that shows what's working in an effort to advocate for sustainment of programs that maybe wouldn't exist post ESSER spending in a land of state budget cuts, in constantly changing local priorities from school boards, district offices, so on and so forth. So I want to sort of use the rest of this time to walk through how our office approaches program and policy evaluation and share some really specific resources that I hope folks can take as they relate to those school funding debates or whatever other interest areas they have, whether it's what programs best support students with high levels of social emotional needs, what programs support English learners, what programs support math instruction and achievement, so on and so forth. And think a little bit about how educators in their already packed schedules, again, as I say this, I'm sure my wife is in the room over putting together lesson plans and probably having, Real Housewives of some franchise on in the background to get through the work. How they can find some time to do so in a way that's a little less intimidating than evaluation shops sort of put it out there. So we're not going to get to a place where everyone is an evaluation expert in 25 minutes or whatever, but I want to provide some tools for structuring these evaluations in a way that recognizes sort of the constant informality of evaluations, evaluating what programs work in the classroom, evaluating what restaurants you want to go to, evaluating the best route to get to work in the morning, and puts it sort of in a structure that can be shared with district leaders, peer educators, and then local, state, and federal policymakers. So the two definitions of policy evaluation are placed there. Folks can kind of read them and ponder them a little bit. But really what we're trying to do is research what's working and what's not working. And I would contend that program evaluation, which is assessing, the effectiveness of a new curriculum or an after-school extracurricular or, some new initiative that's being rolled out in the classroom, a new seating chart, can be paired with and can inform policy evaluation. So I'm going to talk about the school funding context with ESSER, and I would argue that an evaluation of ESSER-funded district efforts, whether it's a new one-on-one tutoring program, whether it's a new curriculum initiative, whether it's a new play-based learning initiative for early childhood, the result of all of those program evaluations can be used to generate a policy evaluation, which says what was the effectiveness of ESSER, what was the effectiveness of these school funding choices in a way that can drive advocacy. There's a really helpful chart on the left that I love to use that sort of goes through that evaluation process. And there are a couple things I want to flag from it as we start thinking about the specifics of evaluation. The first two parts sort of show the need for consensus building on what success criteria look like. And this is really where, if you've heard of SMART goals, specific, measurable, achievable, time-oriented, relevant to your interests, so on and so forth, there's a need to be specific in what we're trying to ascertain. So you could evaluate a new program on a basis of its ability to improve math scores. You could also do so on a basis of student voice, on parental satisfaction, on student participation, on attendance, so on and so forth. And I think it's really important as we move into some of the evaluation matrices that I'll share to think about what is the logic of how this program is improving student experiences and what is the case that I want to make with a very specific goal and a very specific evaluation criterion of what will look like success. Is it success if test scores go up 5%? Of test scores, are you looking at formative assessments like NWEA? Or are you looking at standardized summative assessments like state-based testing or the NAEP or whatever else? The other part of this evaluation scheme that, again, will be even a little bit more concrete with some of the upcoming slides that I'll share is I think it's really important to think about alternatives. Alternatives can be nothing, meaning it's important to compare whatever new program is being assessed and sort of looked at through a lens of changing classroom data compared to the status quo, which is what would have happened if we did nothing. But it's also important to think about the opportunity costs of what investment in a particular program meant. So perhaps you're looking at a new curriculum. And the sense is it did improve student attendance. That's great. Like that's a huge success. But was there another program that would have sort of advanced it even further? And then if this is getting done correctly, it kind of gets to the fun part, which is, selecting and implementing whatever that new piece is. And that's where I want to mention just a couple of policy advocacy best practices and thinking about once classroom data is used to generate some sort of evaluation of what funded programs are working or not working, how is that then communicated to decision makers beyond the classroom, and how is it shared with your network of teacher leaders to petition change in a way to sort of secure and solidify those efforts? This is my like meta schema of evaluation. I should mention really briefly here that a lot of this came from our office's work with MSU Outreach and Engagement and Dr. Miles McNull, who is the evaluation expert I go to on all of these things on a previous workshop we did in terms of ESSER funding. And we heard really great stuff from districts that were able to, on the front end of these efforts, plan a schema for evaluating the effectiveness of, the influx of emails from vendors and partners and prospective, supporters of what their work was doing. I want to focus today on this summative piece, meaning sort of the effectiveness of a program once it has been completed, not the formative piece of what can we do differently in the rollout of this program to ensure it's effective, and specifically kind of dig in to outcome evaluations. And these are sort of helpful for established but relatively young programs. And the focus is of the logic model, which we'll talk about in a second, that has been sold to us, or that we felt would be a positive piece in the classroom. Is the program achieving its objectives that we think are important? So the first thing that I would encourage folks to do in any of these program evaluations, and as you sort of start thinking about the initiatives that are in your classroom and informing the work that exists, is developing a really formal logic model, which sounds scary, but is actually just a conceptual map of where evaluation can go and what measures you're evaluating. And I think you want to think really specifically about what is the idea of why the initiative being supported will generate change, and really specifically map out all of these following pieces. So I put together an ESSER specific example that I wanted to talk about. So say that your issue area of interest is one-on-one tutoring supports that were funded by federal dollars or state dollars or something else. And, as a district, there's some ambiguity about whether those will continue to be supported, whether or not there's an opportunity to do so in light of federal funding cuts, in light of state challenges, in light of ambiguity and uncertainty about the resources that might exist for it. And you as a policy entrepreneur want to kind of champion the effort that you've seen in your classroom, and you have an inkling that sort of suggests that this has been a positive experience. I would start by developing a logic model that follows sort of this approach, which says, what are the things that go into this program? What is required for it? What are our inputs? What does it do? What do we do with those resources? What are our activities? And then what does it generate? And that includes both the outputs, or sort of the process-based things you see that you hope connect with change, and then short-term, intermediate term, and long-term outcomes and impacts that sort of are the promised delivered results. And I think often what happens is folks will support a program or an initiative on the aspiration that if we do X, Y will occur. And there's sort of a black box of like, how does X new curriculum or X new program or X new staff member or whatever translate into Y outcome? And what these logic models do are basically, set up the MapQuest directions that take you through the logic of why funds in a tutoring program might translate into increased student knowledge, increased student awareness as a result of that knowledge, increased student buy-in, which supports growth rates and achievement and public perception of the school and teacher sense of, being in a really high performing, high success area, and sort of then giving back in and pouring back into to the classroom that they care about. So in doing whatever evaluation is, I think you're starting with what is the program of interest? You're moving towards what are the success criteria that I care about, keeping in mind that they're very subjective and kind of open to whatever your community values, but needing to be defined very particularly in that smart fashion. To then developing a formal logic model that goes through and says, if we do X program, it will generate the following activities, which produces specific outcomes. And then I think you're able to sort of take the data that exists, the local test scores, the anecdotes, the student feedback, the narratives, so on and so forth, and make a case that there's some relationship, even if it's just correlational, even if there's just an overlap between the programs that are being invested in and the experiences that are occurring in the classroom. And as I sort of mentioned, you can focus on this from a process lens, which again is the formative piece. It's is the program being rolled out in a way that makes sense, that aligns with the logic model? If you use a soup analogy, you're like tasting the soup as you're cooking, you're adding in a little salt, you're adding in a little pepper, you're changing it as you go. And then if you're looking at the outcomes, it's more of that summative outcome impact evaluation. You're presenting the soup to the party and hopefully people are really, really happy. In terms of structuring this, there's a tool that I'll share. It's in this document. It's also in a separate PDF that we'll make sure gets out there. I would encourage folks to think about both those process and outcome pieces and work through their model before starting to collect some of this data. Again, both thinking about the process, meaning what are the activities, what are the outputs that are happening along the way, and is there fidelity of implementation of those? And then the outcomes, which is the results. And if there's a gap between the sort of logic model of success and the outcomes that are hoped for, sort of both thinking about if that logic model holds and if the process was done with fidelity. Meaning, if your idea was we are going to fund one-on-one tutors to support students with learning recovery in terms of reading because the pandemic had a negative effect on their ability to do so, the process piece is, were we able to hire qualified individuals to show up on a consistent basis and provide the dosage of instruction necessary in order to assume that there would be a positive change? And if not, that might be more of an indictment of how the program was implemented and carried out, its process, its form, than the exact idea of could it work, the sort of summative outcome piece of if all those things are in force and in effect, will it produce the positive gains? So in this case, if I were going through this and my goal was, again, going to an at-risk tutoring program because of ambiguity about resource dollars, I would want to map out what are the indicators or what are the specific and measurable accomplishment, visible things that should be seen with the funding from the program on a process basis. Are folks being hired? Are students showing up? And outcomes, are reading scores changed? Do students have a greater sense of confidence in the text that they engage with, so on and so forth? And then go through and think about what my process for evaluation would look like. In most cases, you can kind of ignore the sampling and design piece. There is a whole side conversation about, do you want to develop some sort of really high level evaluation that compares exposure to your program versus not exposure to your program, randomized controlled treatment, stuff like that. But again, for the stuff that we're doing here and in making these evaluation pieces able to be fit into all the other demands on teacher leaders on a daily basis, I think you're mostly looking at the population of your classroom and looking at all students engaged with the program. And if you have some students who didn't engage with it, or if there's another classroom that didn't engage with it that you could compare it with, that's just a cherry on top of the sundae. The thing I do want to talk about and the thing I do want to emphasize is that data collection piece. And I think that oftentimes folks feel very stuck in quantitative data and feel concerned to sort of create summary tables that say, what are the average NWEA scores or state level assessment scores of students who engage with the program compared to the students who didn't? And they're like, don't love that. That's a little math heavy. I feel you. And I think those approaches are great, but I just wanted to emphasize too that I think oftentimes there's an stated place for qualitative data, not numbers, aggregate experiences of students, parents, educators, and others in the educational ecosystem to inform some of these evaluations. So I would say, beyond just evaluating the effectiveness of a program or a new curriculum or whatever piece you're going to eventually advocate on when you sort of think about your role as a policy entrepreneur in the policy cycle, advocating for added funding, added support, sustained funding and support of programs that are maybe on the chopping block, I would encourage folks to think about creative ways to capture experience that tell the story of why a program matters. And these can be especially helpful too in that aforementioned logic model of connecting, well, why does investment in tutors sort of generate test score increases? You might hear stories about students talking about they developed a relationship with someone who made them feel comfortable in the classroom, and that's kind of all it took. Or they were able to generate a list of texts that they were interested in, and they haven't had that before. And I think there are ways to do it with surveys, with interviews, with focus groups where you're talking to small groups of students, whether it's over lunch or in a break or in a transition period, or even observations. The other thing I'd mention is we've seen some really, really interesting efforts of folks who've taken non-traditional approaches. So Google Jamboard is dead, which is really sad for me because I loved Jamboard for all of our facilitation. But there's Figma, which is a close second. And we've seen districts work with teachers and students to kind of create post-its that react to questions like this in a way that is way less formal than filling out a Qualtrics survey, or ask folks to do TikTok testimonials or virtual graffiti that takes art and sort of does it as a way of demonstrating support or interest areas of where things go. Obviously, with any of these, there's always FERPA considerations. There's obviously a need to protect student data and privacy, to consult parents and make sure that sort of they're informed and providing consent for student feedback in the evaluative process. Those data pieces sort of come before everything and build the trust in whatever evaluation you're doing as a credible and safe and approachable thing anyways. But all of this is to say, well, I think there is value and there is merit in really rigidly structuring an evaluation using some of the aforementioned tools. I think there's a lot of room to be creative and think about sort of what data is being used to say a program is effective or ineffective. There are some pitfalls. Again, I think you want to be careful with the conclusions that are drawn, though I think there's an understated emphasis now on just kind of collecting some of those stories and points of emphasis. And these are the things that I would keep in mind. So, the core basis of any evaluation is holding all things equal, ceteris paribus, which is like the Latin, which again, my wife was originally going to study Latin, so I feel like it's been imparted on me. Ended up in math, which is not my forte, despite the data and evaluation piece. But also thinking about the effects of timing, like did the program precede whatever thing I'm thinking of in making sure that there is some sort of relationship. There's always mixed outcomes. There's a risk of, unrealistic expectations. I included a picture of Turkey's parliament fighting. I probably could have picked something more close to home in light of all the challenges that exist with polarization in the last few years. But then also being really careful about this third variable's concern, or the idea that, correlation, things that move in the same direction, do not always imply causation, or whatever X program should lead to doesn't always do so. And that's where there's this like famous correlation causation database where if you notice, ice cream sales often rise with murders. There's a correlation between the two. The good humor guy is not, a serial killer. It instead is an overlapping third variable effect of when it's warm out, there's often more ice cream sales. When it's warm out, people are often outside more, and there's a greater propensity for violence and things like that. So all that's to say, there's uncertainty, there's ambiguity built in. But one thing I worry about is that evaluation and policy advocacy get placed on such a pedestal for perfection and academic rigor that we cordon people out from amalgamating useful data to support. So again, the lesson of this piece is not go into the world and posit that you have put forth a perfect quantitative evaluation that controls for all third variables and says with 100% certainty that X program is driving student achievement gains. But I think there are creative ways to approach evaluation, even in just a descriptive sense, that can inform some policy advocacy pieces and elevate educators beyond a place of being acted upon to informing some of those conversations. The last thing I wanted to say, and then I have a slide with some contact info, and I already see there are 2 or 3 questions in the chat, and I'm happy to sort of make this an informal conversation in the time that we have, is trying to link this to policy advocacy or policy effectiveness if that advocacy piece feels a little uncomfortable. I want to talk about it in what I will call the West Wing 90s version of politics, the like Schoolhouse Rock, I'm just a bill. If we all just share the data and talk to each other, we can achieve anything, which I love and I still hope for. I am rewatching The Western right now. And then I want to talk about it a little bit more in the like Veep political chaos. Sometimes more data does not always fix the problem type way. I want to start optimistically. And I want to say that I think there are a lot of actors, whether they are superintendents making funding choices, boards of education representing parents who are deeply invested in their youth's experience, local lawmakers, state lawmakers, federal lawmakers who want to use data to build the case for programs and build the case for investment. There are great ways to take whatever insights you generate, whether it's students providing stories about how they were positively impacted by a specifically ESSER funded program and communicate with specific decision makers. I included a hyperlink in the Texas context where folks can pull up their address, type in, and see every single representative they have on a local, state, and federal level, along with contact information for those offices. And I'd encourage folks to think about how you can leverage some of these best practices in sharing whatever is found. So, we started with the idea of teachers as policy entrepreneurs. We've talked about one specific place where there's an opportunity, there's perhaps a policy window to steal another one of Kingdon's concepts or an opening for advocacy. And then talked about how folks can take classroom and district level data and structure it in an evaluative sense to generate some findings. I would encourage folks to take those findings and communicate with policymakers in some of the following ways. I think there is a strong impulse to only ever engage with government when things are not going the way we want. There's a vote and everyone like races to the phone lines and it's like, here's the 10 different ways you're betraying your constituents and we're mad. I think there are opportunities to celebrate positives instead and to say, hey, you gave us this generational life-changing federal support via ESSER funds. Here's what we did with it, and here's some of the evidence of impact. Thank you so much. Please consider us for future appropriations. I think there are ways to think about what sort of leave behinds folks can leave with those folks, so it's not just like a one-off, hello, I'm here, goodbye. We were supposed to do that with our 1-pager for ESSER. I am long-winded, and it is like a 2-pager. You could cut it down even more, add some more pictures, add some more graphics. There's tailoring the message that you're bringing to your audience. So what are the values that the person you're engaging with is most concerned with? And again, this goes back to that success criterion piece of doing evaluations, which is what is the metric of success that folks are interested in? And then the last thing, and I think this is the most important one as we think a little bit about how teacher leaders can balance the sort of doing evaluations with the policy advocacy piece, is the power of networks and that folks don't need to go it alone. For one, there's positivity in folks leveraging those and sort of greater voice in more folks coming together. But there's also a lot of folks that are already looped in, whether they are lobbyists for associations or unions or whatever network folks have that you might be able to link up with, share some of your insights, and they can use that as a resource and as a tool to sort of advocate for policy change. Again, district level, state level, federal level. When that is a little naive, I have been accused of being a Pollyanna sometimes and overly optimistic that just more data, more information creates change. I think we see that stories, narratives, testimony, and experiences really carry a certain level of primacy. And I think, again, this is sort of a case for an added emphasis on qualitative data and stories in whatever evaluations are done. And I think there's a lot of needles to be moved on giving people the experience of what being an educator is like and what working with a specific program is like on a firsthand basis. Education, in a political sense, and I'm not the first person to note this, I wish I was, is a really challenging political space because, unlike other areas, everyone's engaged with school. They've been in a classroom or they've had a student who've gone through it. And sometimes that generates a sense of expertism among policymakers, at every level, that they might have a sense of what's going on. And I think there are opportunities to sort of share really positive narratives and really positive experiences, and the need for sort of greater engagement and support as policy entrepreneurs, as teacher leaders that have capacity to make a change, and are not sort of just subjected to the whims of what's ever going on around them. Okay, I said 45. I knew I was going to be a little bit longer than that, but hopefully it was helpful context. And for the YouTubers who are watching, you can listen to it on like 1.5 or whatever, and fast forward whatever. I'm not going to go through all this. There's my email. There's a bunch of contacts for our office. Please feel free to reach out. Please feel free to engage. I really appreciate the effort of this program to elevate teacher leadership, get folks exposed to great research that exists out there beyond Texas, but also in Texas. And I'm optimistic that this can really generate some helpful coalitions and partnerships going forward. So I will stop there. I saw there were some questions in the chat. And let me see. Ooh, I love that Josh has the YouTube overlap. I also love the taco for the Choco Taco, which is really, really good. Okay. You all have great long comments. Give me like 2 seconds to read the first one, and then I'm happy to address it. So what is the role played by teachers, and what contributions do they make to data analysis if teachers are not program developers themselves? Okay. Can you give a specific real life example of how teachers use data and analysis to inform policy advocacy? What do you mean by policy entrepreneur, and how can a teacher be one? Okay, awesome, great. So I think in many ways, the fact that teachers are not the ones directly involving many of these programs or developing many of these programs is why they're most needed. I think there is expertism that is held in the classroom about what works and what doesn't work, and what is going on and what is not going on, that can challenge the logic models that folks sort of begin with about why a piece of curriculum might be effective. And my argument for this is, think back to any like ILT meeting or PLC you've been in where someone has been like, I have the solution to student engagement. You are just going to do X, Y, and Z. And you are like, that is going to backfire. And you clearly have not been in a classroom in 20 years. And so what I mean by policy entrepreneurship here is taking advantage of the expertise that teachers have to collect data on the programs and the curriculum and the tools that they're being asked to implement, and to provide that feedback back to the folks that are making the decision about what is being done in the classroom on a macro level, again, district, state, federal, to nudge them in a particular direction that might be more effective. So using a really specific example, I can think of a district we partner with who on a local level felt their curriculum was not meeting their students' needs, and was not engaging enough to drive the sort of student voice and participation and engagement that like is needed to get kids invested in the classroom. We had teachers sort of try and collect and amalgamate and bring together qualitative representations of those experiences and share it with district leaders who were ultimately tasked with providing guidance to the school board on what curriculum would be supported. That's a case in a local context of a teacher being a policy entrepreneur to inform sort of what's decided on a district level and hopefully effectuate change in what's impacting them in the classroom. And my contention is that that can sort of be extrapolated to the state or the federal government. Okay. Second question, and then if you all have any stuff, I'm happy to open it up. We can just talk. But it was, how do you combine qualitative and quantitative research? Qualitative addresses certain questions, quantitative doesn't, but sometimes it's hard to bring those together with the challenge of causality. Yes, 100%. So the best thing I would say is I've heard folks describe qualitative research through a lens of trying to understand specific phenomenon and why things are occurring, and quantitative research seeking to establish generalizable takeaways of causality of pieces like that. And I think the place for both is qualitative research to dig into a phenomenon that we might not know particularly well quite yet, and quantitative research to sort of scale up and understand the generalizability of that in a broader context. So in this case, if you're trying to just generate a case for a specific program, I think qualitative research is awesome. And it can be a really helpful way to generate stories and narratives and testimonials that inform the perspective of district leaders, state leaders, and federal leaders. If your goal is to sort of make a case that X caused Y, that's where I think you need to think more about evaluative design that looks at a treatment group versus a control group, and tries to sort of control for third variables, and gets sort of more into the weeds of an evaluation course. And there are great resources that are frankly even more qualified than me on that piece. Again, Dr. Miles McNall, MSU, if folks want to look out to him, he's incredible, and I'm sure would be able to support stuff as well. Okay, I'm going to pause there. I saw Rebecca added an evaluation link. If folks have an opportunity to do that, that would be really helpful. And then I will also just pause if anyone else would like to share any questions, concerns, fears, hopes, lost loves, whatever finds you on this Wednesday.
Shinyan Kim also has a question too. I want to make sure, unless you were just addressing that, but I think you were addressing Tuyin's question.
Yeah. I think I spoke a little to the qualitative quantitative piece, but I think it's the constant battle. And I think I love the point made that there's value in both, because I think in the higher ed space that I've been in, you often find people fiercely in one camp or the other, where they're all in on quant stuff or they're all in qual stuff. And again, use your strengths, and really strongly consider. Yeah, I think that's true too, that school administrators and program developers play a larger role. I think that's where number of voices can be really, really powerful. And petitioning those folks before trying to advocate for broader change. So maybe there is a challenge in going straight from the classroom level to the state house, but I bet there's a lot of power in going from the classroom level to the PLC level to the administrative level to linking together various districts across, in Michigan, our ISDs or county levels of government, to then advocate and petition for change. No one's an island, and I think that even with many of those barriers, there's a really cool opportunity for folks to share what's happening in their classrooms, especially at the start of the year as new things are getting rolled out, and hopefully advocate change. But there are definitely challenges along the way too.
I'll give space for one last burning question if anyone has one, or any kind of testimonial that you would like to add. We found a new type of dryer sheet you're very excited about. If not, what? Oh, go ahead, Tyler.
Mine's not at all important. Are there any Dallas Cowboy fans on the call? I know we're Topeka, Texas. No? Okay, good. Well, my Packers play the Cowboys this week, so that was going to be my burning taunt or whatever. But no, I love Texas. Huge fan. Again, huge thanks to Rebecca and team for putting on this series.